I'm Anastasia Kavada from the University of Westminster, and I will be coordinating the discussion here. Now, before we start with the discussion, I have an announcement from Helen. Those of you who are planning to come here tomorrow, please make sure that you keep your badges and that you wear them tomorrow. Okay, so that's housekeeping done for now. So as the title of this panel reveals, we will be focusing today on the relationship between journalists and activists, a relationship that can be very productive for both parties, but which is often fraught with conflict and tension and frustration. So we will be looking at how protest is reported in the media, whether this reporting is accurate, and also what are the factors that influence this reporting. We will also be looking at the strategies that activists employ to ensure a positive portrayal in the media. And some of our panelists may also be reflecting on how social media and new media are actually changing this process. Now, I know that many of us are actually studying those issues from an academic point of view in our academic work. But in this panel today, we wanted to explore these issues from the point of view of the activists and the journalists themselves. So we are very fortunate to have these panelists here with us today, and we're very grateful that they could join us. So let me proceed with the introductions. On my left, on the journalist side, although I'm not sure, it's Paul Mason. Many of you probably know him. Paul is the economics editor of the BBC's flagship current affairs program, Newsnight. He has been nominated for an Emmy for his work with the BBC World News America. He has also twice been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for his blog at the BBC. Paul has authored acclaimed books on globalization, the working class, the economic crisis, and activism. These include Meltdown, The End of the Age of Greed, and more recently, Live Working or Die Fighting. Now, one of his latest books is Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions, which explores the causes and implications of current global unrest from the Arab Spring to the Occupy movement. This is an acclaimed book. It is now in its second edition with a slightly altered title, Why It's Still Kicking Off Everywhere, because let's face it, it's still kicking off everywhere. I should also say that Paul was recently reported from the front line on the protests in Turkey, so maybe he will also be reflecting on this in his talk today. Now, on my far right, on the activist side, it's Spyros Limneos. Spyros was part of the press team of the Occupy the London Stock Exchange, so he will be reflecting on his work with the team there. Which involved monumental effort and dedication, judging only by the number of tweets and press releases and Facebook posts and other media material that was either produced or coordinated by this team. Spyros has also worked as a campaigner for 38 Degrees and also Cancer Research UK. And I should also say that he is a University of Westminster graduate. He graduated from the then BA Media Studies, now BA Journalism, in 2006. Which, a shout out also to all of our BA students here who have been helping with the conference, filming, taking photographs, tweeting and reporting. You have been doing an amazing job. And on my right, and straddling the academic activist divide, is Chris Nineham. Chris is one of the founder members and now one of the national officers of the Stop the War Coalition in the UK. He was also one of the leading activists in Globalized Resistance, an anti-globalization network that mobilized thousands of people to protest against neoliberal globalization, as also to participate in the European and the World Social Forums. Now, these are ongoing protests, as we see with the Stop G8 protests that are going on in the UK at the moment. Chris is also involved in the Coalition of Resistance, which is a national campaign against cuts and privatization in the UK. Now, he recently published a book called The People versus Tony Blair, Politics, the Media, and the Anti-War Movement. He has some copies here with him if you want to buy one. But he is also finishing his PhD at the University of Westminster on exactly this topic, the representation of the anti-war movement in the media. So he will be reflecting on these issues, both as an activist and as an academic. So thank you all for joining us in what promises to be an interesting discussion. Now, each one of you can take 10 to 15 minutes to talk about those issues. Then we can have some time for questions and comments between the members of the panel, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So, Paul, could you go first?
Yeah, thank you for that. I will stand up because I can see people at the back. No, I want to sit down because that doesn't reach. Right, back, hello. I'm going to just offer a quite disjointed series of observations that may, everything's on the record. Please feel free to tweet it. I've just tweeted that hashtag. About what I've learned from doing the stuff I do. My day job is economics editor of Newsnight, and I think, because I've written books about both the crisis, saying the crisis was worse than most people thought it was when I did, 2009, and because I've written a book about protest, I get to do some, not enough, reporting of protest. At the height of the anti-globalization movement, it was actually mooted that the BBC should maybe have a protest correspondent, but it never happened. So there's numerous ones devoted to the subsets of every region in the world and every subject in the world except protest. So this is just kind of where I am at the moment about the job I do when I do that job. The first thing I want to try and throw at you is I think the fact that the mainstream media is generally rubbish at reporting protests matters much less than it used to. 5 years ago, I used to walk into a protest situation, say climate camp, say, anything really, BNP, and everybody's going, you so-and-sos, you're terrible, you don't reflect the reality of people's lives, you're just biased, metropolitan, whatever, okay? And I would have an argument saying, okay, well, what I try and do is this. This is me. Forget my colleagues. Forget something you've just seen. Just look at what I've done and then see whether you still think that. And then, by the way, I'm going to do some hard reporting about you and your objectives and what's happening. Now I just say, why do you even care? Why do you even care? The MSM is completely, you can completely circumnavigate it except in one regard. That is, I'll come to what the important regard is. But in fact, all the stuff coming out of Taksim and Gezi Park in the last 10 days has generally been far faster, far more authentic from the protesters and from what you might call citizen journalists. There's a new class of citizen journalists, which is the freelance who goes to these things, and they are often, they'll Kickstarter it with their mates, they'll have a little fund ready for action, they'll go. I've worked with several of them in the last 10 days. That's the reporting. Of course, good reporting done by MSM people, Sky, us, CNN, to name but three, youngish reporters who, able to stand tear gas for longer than I can, out there doing the reporting, by virtue of being young, bring a freshness to it and a communications ability. But why do you care, given that you can produce and consume independent of the MSM? Bandwidth is less of an issue. My pro account on Vimeo cost me $9 a month. I'll tell you a bit about what I did on Vimeo in the last 10 days in a minute. And I think that is my challenge, because the one instance, I said to the boss of a major campaigning NGO this year, do you still care about Main Street? Why are you here meeting me? Why do you still care? And he said, it's fantastically important that we get our profile into mainstream media organizations, but the reason is because that's who politicians watch. If they see me on Newsnight, they'll take me seriously. There was nothing in his media plan that was about addressing tens of thousands of people. They're not interested because they know they can address them direct. So that's like point one, and these things have an annoying habit of switching off while you're trying to refer to them. So that's the exception. Point two, I think the reason for this is what has changed. What has changed is specifically, I always talk about three things that are driving the current round of protest. One, the neoliberal era is over, the idea set is finished, it's falsified, the system doesn't work. People your age, the young people in this room, it promised you everything. Now you're going to have to pay 30 grand just to be a graduate. It promised you everything, it promised you better of everything. You have to work till you're 70. Okay? You're the first generation since the 30s whose lives are worse than your parents, and hey, surprise, surprise, you're protesting, but protesting in a different way, in a way that is no longer, as me and Chris and maybe you, we grew up in a world where all protest was about left, right, labour movement, working class versus the rest. maybe a few what we used to call lifestyle politics on the edge of it, women's rights, gay rights. Now it's completely inverted for the second reason, which is, I think, so I said 3 reasons. 1, neoliberalism doomed. 2, we have technology has provided us with a whole tool set of both protesting and reporting that, as I'll talk about in a minute, are remarkably similar. Now, this is the interesting thing. If you said the tool set of engineering and reporting is incredibly close to each other, you'd think, well, it would be naturally that us reporters and the engineers working on aerospace projects might get together and occasionally meet, but they never do. But the interesting thing is, the tool set of protesting and the tool set of reporting are so close, and yet the methodologies of the two are so distant. And then point sort of 3 of this point that I'm going through is the networked individual. Manuel Castells talks about networked individual. Sociologist Barry Wellman, I've written a bit about it. I've written a lot of observational journalism about what I call the networked individual, which is people who have weak ties to each other, are young, are not really mainly defined by their role at work, but in their non-work time, and that when they protest, they use as tools for protest the very tools you're using if you work in this mercurial, not networked workforce. So you don't see mass walkouts, you don't see mass behavioural solidarities. I once reported on a French general strike where the teachers all stood around about a metre away from each other, and the railway workers all stood about a foot away from each other when there was nobody else in the field. They started out like that. That's how workers were. You're not like that. So the individual footprint is bigger, and it leads to different behaviours when protests take place. To me, as an observer of it, this is one of the most interesting things, because I have lived through the change. To you, what does the change matter? What does it matter that those sapeurs-pompiers or whoever they were all standing together, what does it matter? But to me, it's the biggest change in my life, as well as the inversion of what protest's been about. Point 3, Turkey. Let me give you a quick rundown of what I did. Okay, so this is interesting. Took a bit of persuading to get them to send me, not because Newsnight isn't interested in things like that, but we always have to weigh, can we bring something more than after you've seen 24-hour news worth of 3 channels with people coughing into their tear gas masks, can we bring anything more? And the answer is yes, we're interested in that, and the idea is it's the 2 sides to the story. I understand it, so get down there. So I get there Sunday. As it turned out, my producer and cameraman couldn't get there at the same time as me, so I literally dumped my stuff and went out with a Nikon D3100, which, if you know what that is, it's a toy Nikon camera. Okay, because somebody nicked my real one. So I go out with the Nikon and start shooting in SD. Because that's all it shoots in. And shot a little bit of peaceful stuff, went back, uploaded it to Vimeo as a very quick, almost montage of footage, which I edited on FCP in my hotel room. Headed straight out there and straight into the riot. And shot for about 3 hours right at the front of the riot. And there were not many shooters or stills photographers. There was only a few of us. And we could tell who they were because they were only people wearing gas masks and helmets. That's how amateurish that Turkish protest is. Nobody came. You know, in Greece, everybody's got a gas mask. Everybody's got Malox. There, nobody. So we're there and managed to do that. Managed to survive getting hit in the head with a CS gas canister because I had my helmet on. Those of you who report that, wear your helmet at all times. And I am not joking. And got back. 2 a.m. local, and I just realised I got fantastic footage. So again, uploaded it to Vimeo. This is without telling my bosses I'd done any of this. I mean, I phoned in and made the usual necessary calls about what's the piece going to be tomorrow, but I just thought, got to get this out. Then my producer cameraman turned up, and we go out again at 4 a.m. into a quite more peaceful Taksim Square, and we headed to the hospital. And if you saw my piece, which broadcast Monday last week, we then did a sequence at the hospital. But the interesting thing was there, they were going, we need the MSM to report this. And we were going, well, we're here, we're reporting it. They said, well, yeah, we can't see it. You know, we can't even see BBC World, and anyway, your stuff's not been on it, and blah, blah, blah. I just said, right, Vimeo, look at this on my iPhone, there it is. And they just literally started all phoning each other going, look at this, go on here. So that's, now why am I telling you this? This is like 1/2 shift in my day. What it strikes me is how many of the tools I'm using that are incredibly similar to theirs. And therefore, it's not just that I'm saying, MSM, you know, kind of it's responded and it reacts to Twitter and it reacts to, suppose you turn up with a, you know, and do some kind of action and we have to be there with our cameras. What I'm saying is that we spontaneously are in that world. I'm tweeting, I'm Vimeoing, and I'm doing off the side of a desk with my own camera, not issued to me by the BBC, and for the record, with my own cycle helmet, actually, which I keep with me so I can always go places without having to go into work and get the issued cycle helmet, which looks ridiculous. So isn't it interesting that we're starting to act off the side of the desk, as I call it, you know, informally. Final couple of points. I would like to stress the independence and impartiality of journalists who do what I do, all the journalists who are there as journalists. If you're in a protest and you're protesting, that's good for you if the protest is interesting, but you're not, you know, your protest is the first thing. I think we still have to conceptually differentiate between that and being maybe a committed journalist or even an impartial one like me. And the reason for that is the biggest meme in my world is getting attacked by protesters now. That is the biggest thing. In Greece, in 2011, when it was really, really heavy, we would go down, film, riots going crazy. Eventually people spot you, black bloc people spot you. And it turns out some of the people who spotted you were also incipient Golden Dawn people. They weren't just the left. And then bang, straight in the face, cameraman, straight in the face. You're German, you know, we're taking your camera, F you, etc. After 3 days of doing it, the best day of my life almost in the Greece situation was we're on this massive street being carried along by a crowd. And when it all calmed down, somebody came up to me and almost said, "What the heck are you doing? We keep seeing you and people keep hitting you and you keep coming. Why?" And we just said, "Well, because we're the BBC and we're interested." And I just said to them, "Look around you now. Do you see any other TV crews?" "Ah, no." "Why?" "Because they're frightened of you, and also some of them are MSM people who are allied to the government and they probably have a reason to be frightened of you." So that's what I'm proudest of doing, but you're carving out the right to be an independent observer. So that when people do stupid things, how do you think we know whether or not any of these provocateurs, you know, in Greece or in Turkey are provocateurs? Because we've got cameras good enough to spot, they've got police radios in their pockets. That's why we're there. But also, when people do stupid things, we want to maintain our independence. And I will carry on arguing with protesters face to face that there is a social role for that. That there's a thing about identifying faces, which is an issue, but apart from, you know, masks exist, so, you know, the social role of the journalist, I think, in this era of rapid breakdown and protest is important, and those are my insights. I'm hoping that people have got sensible questions to fire at me so I know more clearly what you want to talk about.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Nice comments about Greece. Interesting comments about Greece and Turkey. Half of the panel is also Greek, I should say. So that's a nice segue to Spyros, Occupy LSX.
Thank you. I guess I simply was one of the thousands of people who were inspired by the people-powered movements that started with the Arab Spring and then spread to Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And at the same time in Britain, do I need to? Okay. And at the same time in Britain, there was a lot of anger and frustration against the financial sector and the injustices, social and economic injustices that it created, but there was no sign of the movement spreading to Britain. So at some point in 2011, in summer 2011, I read in Adbusters magazine about an action called Occupy Wall Street. And at the time, there wasn't really much information about it. It was just a hashtag. So I started following it. And I realized that it was basically the same movement, but it was kind of like rebranded into Occupy and with a bit of a clear target, which was big banks. So I thought that was a great opportunity to coordinate something here in London, the financial capital of Europe, in order to send a clear message to world leaders. So I started looking to see if there was anything happening here, if people had the intention of organizing something. Couldn't find anything, so I started by opening a couple of social media accounts on Facebook and Twitter. And through that, I met some other people. We had an initial meeting. We were like 6 or 7 of us. Mainly, there were people from the Spanish 15M movement who were based here in London. So we agreed to, at the time we had like a couple of hundreds of followers. So we agreed to call them to occupy the Bank of England at the time, on the same day as Occupy Wall Street was meant to kick off on the 17th of September 2011. When you organize a direct action, you know, the first thing you look at is whether there is police and media there. If there's no cops or journalists, then that's not a good sign. So we were about 60 of us. There was no police, there was no journalists. So we just looked at each other. We were like, it's not going to happen today. So we just left. We went home. But what was surprising was that Occupy Wall Street, that was definitely more successful than our action here on that day. It wasn't covered by the mainstream media, but social media were on fire, literally. And that lasted for about 2 weeks until a video of a girl in New York, a girl that was pepper sprayed by the police, went viral, and then it actually became mainstream news, and then mainstream outlets started reporting Occupy Wall Street. So as soon as that was a crucial moment for Occupy London, because when Occupy Wall Street became mainstream news, then we had thousands of people joining the social media accounts that we had opened. And also there was a really good opportunity because the Spanish Indignados movement had called for a global day of action on the 15th of October. So we had another meeting, and basically we decided, we were about 10 of us, we split the group in half. Half of us focused on communications and media, and the other half focused on logistics. So we had about 2 weeks to organize the whole thing. We sent the first press release out about probably 4 days before the actual occupation outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was immediately picked up by the main news agencies like Reuters, Press Association, and then the day after, the press phone just didn't stop ringing, and was like everyone from BBC, CNN, and it didn't stop for probably the next 4 or 5 months. So in that sense, we were very lucky that we had the mainstream media coverage even before the action, which is, it's not very common. Usually actions are covered after, not before they happen. And if I could describe the first reaction of mainstream media was actually quite positive. The first week, even the Daily Mail had a very positive story on Occupy London, and they were actually conveying our messages pretty accurately, despite the fact that their sub-editor decided to basically publish the story with a headline, something like, "Move over, Swampy, it's us who should be protesting there." But still, you know, the message went across even to Daily Mail readers. So the role of the press team was to, send out press releases. At some point, we were even sending out like about 3 or 4 press releases a day, and they were all covered, organize training for activists to be like spokespeople, monitoring press coverage, organizing press launches. Pretty much everything was very intense 4 or 5 months because of the amount of media attention that we were receiving. I guess one of the challenges that we faced was labeling. Occupy London was labeled by mainstream media as an anti-capitalist protest, which is, I mean, it was a very diverse movement. So there were all sorts of different people from all walks of life, and not all of them would describe themselves as anti-capitalists. And it's kind of like a term that is quite vague. I mean, what does it mean to be an anti-capitalist? Is it do you want to see like trade abolished, or any form of private ownership, or do you just disagree with free market and neoliberal economics? Or it's a term that is really that involves a kind of like for someone who watches from home the news and he or she hears about anti-capitalist protests, and then they might think, well, actually, I agree with some of the things they say, but does that make me an anti-capitalist? And if I'm an anti-capitalist, then what does that make me? Does it make me a communist? Or so it is a bit confusing. So we tried to focus on the things that bring us together, because the values that brought us together were the same, and there was no doubt about it. So in all the press, there was no. We wouldn't use the term anti-capitalist. All the press releases that we would send out, we would start by saying Occupy London, the movement for social and economic justice. However, the media just basically ignored that term that we were trying to push as something that unites us. And they continued with every report and every article starting by saying anti-capitalist protesters. I guess another challenge was that the mainstream media were always trying to find leaders in the movement. And it was a very horizontal movement. There was no leadership, and they were struggling with it. And the reason why they were trying to find leaders was because they wanted to basically strip them apart. And they tried to do that with, they could see that there was no leader, so they would just, we had journalists from certain papers visiting the camp and picking the most kind of colorful characters or vulnerable people, and even sometimes not even disclosing from which paper they were writing for. So yeah, I mean, one day they would present us as junkies. The other day we would be scroungers, benefit scroungers, or the next day we would be millionaires' kids. So it was like it was something like different every day depending on what they on their agenda basically. So. Another challenge that we faced was also superficial reporting. So many stories were written about Occupy London, but because of the geographic position of the camp, that we ended up camping outside St. Paul's Cathedral, a lot of ink was wasted on the relationship between the movement and the church, which kind of took us off message, and it was really difficult to keep the message focused, especially the first month. We also, we did receive a lot of positive press, and we did spark a massive debate, but also negative press was quite, especially after Christmas 2011, which was a very heavy winter, and we were in a legal battle with the City of London Corporation, and so many resources were spent. By resources, I mean money and also time on this legal battle, and that meant that we didn't have the time to outreach to communities or do more direct action, or basically be more proactive. And so we were not giving food to the media. So when we were not giving food to them, they were trying to find that themselves, and the food that they were finding wasn't necessarily what we would give them. So the camp wasn't news anymore. So they were trying to find other things to pick on because we were still there. I guess internally, the challenges the press team faced was that because of the power it had, automatically when you have access to social media accounts, when you're the first point of contact for journalists, it puts you in a position where of power that you have to be very careful how to manage, and you have to be very balanced, because in one hand you want to give a clear message to the outside world, but on the other hand you have to be very careful, because when you supposed to talk about such a diverse movement like Occupy, you don't want to alienate parts of it. So overall, I think if I could describe the relationship of Occupy London with the media, it was love and hate. They hated to love us, and they loved to hate us, and vice versa. And we needed them to reach more people, and they needed us because we had opened that massive debate and we were generating news. But they didn't always want to play our game, and we didn't always want to play theirs.
Thank you very much. Thank you. for this very honest account of what was going on. Chris, what do you have to add to that?
Okay, well, is this mic working? Yeah. I mean, I think the background to all this is that we're in kind of uncharted territory when it comes to the relationship between protest and the media. And I think you know when you're in uncharted territory when a normally very right-wing journalist, Simon Jenkins, writes in The Guardian, as he did today, an article basically celebrating the power of mass protest in the squares across the world. And I think actually just looking around, it's fascinating just in the last couple of days. I mean, look at the situation in Greece where the government has literally pulled the plugs on public service broadcasting, just turned it off sort of systematically round the country while it's on air, surrounded the main TV stations with riot police and basically said public service broadcasting is no more, it is disbanded. And this is a situation we're in where, on the one hand, there clearly is a return of mass protest that you can trace back, to the end of the 90s, really, on a global scale, but something that's accelerated in recent years, which combines with the emergence of real social and political crisis at the core of the system in various different places. And I think what we need to do really is to rethink, and what I want to sort of just make some remarks on is a kind of rethinking of the main paradigms of the relationship between the media and protest, both in academia and actually on the left and in the movement. And I want to start by saying that I am going to focus on the mainstream media, partly just to be different, and partly because I do think actually the mainstream media remains very important in the generation of ideas and loyalties in contemporary society. I mean, the truth of the matter is the majority of people get their news and current affairs from the big corporates or the big state broadcasters. That, for all the importance of the points that both my colleagues have made about new media, the truth of the matter is, and I think it's very important for the movement as a whole, if the movement takes seriously the task of trying to appeal to and project its messages and its attempt at solidarity to the mainstream of society, then really you can't ignore the mainstream media, and you do so at your peril. And this is very, very difficult because just for a moment to discuss academia. I mean, there is in academia a very powerful and convincing body of work which shows that in general, historically, the mainstream media has kind of systematically downplayed, marginalised, demonised and demeaned protest and popular movements in a very systematic and comprehensive way. And in fact, this is a consensus, essentially, amongst those in academia who may have a left bias, but in general, the research that has been done on the way media covers protests has almost unanimously come up with this notion that essentially there's a marginalisation going on. So much so, in fact, that there's a term, the protest paradigm, which describes what is regarded as a characteristic response or a series of characteristic responses by the mainstream media towards protest, which range from kind of total silence to open contempt and demonisation. And I mean, there's all sorts of different ways this works. I mean, I've recently been studying, which is what Anastasia was referring to. I've been studying the anti-war movement and the media response to the anti-war movement. And back in the day, in the 1990s, when there was during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 91, just to give you one sort of actually alarmingly characteristic example of one element of the protest paradigm, The Sun ran an article on a reasonably sized protest, which went as follows. As the UN deadline passed, out crawled the usual collection of students, in inverted commas, God-botherers, Guardian readers, gays, communists, trots, men with beards and duffel coats, men with ponytails, women, spelt W-I-M-M-I-N, in men's shoes, and old hippies with worn-out Country Joe and the Fish LPs. This is actually characteristic of one kind of historic response by the mainstream media. Now, there's all sorts of other things. The liberal media, on the whole, has essentially operated, I mean, this is a gross caricature, but I've only got a few minutes, essentially operated by downplaying the importance and often just completely ignoring protest. And one of the things I discovered in my research, that at the Guardian newspaper, until 2002, until the anti-war movement really kicked off just over a decade ago, the Guardian had a formal policy of saying that demonstrations were not newsworthy. Now, there were exceptions to this even then, but basically that was their attitude, that presumably, and my interview suggested, the implication was that they tended to be unrepresentative, they had no impact on society, and essentially nothing interesting to say. And actually the BBC had a similar policy. I mean, not quite as open and systematic, but we were actually leaked a written email to Newsnight people. Paul might have been on Newsnight at the time, which said that at the beginning of the war, please don't interview people who are in principle against the war. We only want to talk to people who think there's been tactical mistakes, essentially. The idea being, again, that, you know, these are kind of marginal figures who are kind of semi-nutcases who don't really deserve an airing in public or the stamp of approval that going on Newsnight provides you. So, you know, that's a kind of very, very brief sketch of the kind of the sort of the historical record, and certainly the conventional view of the historical record. Now, I mean, none of this is particularly surprising, perhaps, if you glance at the statistics about ownership of media, the mainstream, it's, you know, almost universally owned by big corporates or government, or run by governments, and therefore not predisposed to take very kindly to protest, which tends to be anti-status quo and anti-elite. And, you know, I also, just in passing, want to mention, and I think this does have some importance today, I want to mention that many of the kind of the more sophisticated and influential theorizations of media influence in society tend very much to stress the power of the media, and tend very much to stress a kind of homogenous view that the media is kind of hostile to the left, and, you know, institutionally and kind of comprehensively against mass protest. And here I'm talking about clearly some of the left theories, the Chomskyite theories, the Foucauldian theories. All of these things tend to really stress the power of this, you know, monolithic ideological machine that operates in society. And I mean, I take a lot from those people. I think they're important. But for now, I just want to try and stress some of their limitations, both of the protest paradigm as a kind of more empirical exercise, but also of some of the theoretical approaches which inform academia, large parts of it, but also very much influential in the movement. Because my experience, and actually a lot of what you were saying about Occupy bears this out, but certainly my experience during the Stop the War period was very much that the protest paradigm, in certain circumstances, can really break down, and that it's not actually adequate to say that at all times and in all situations the media is kind of uniformly hostile to protest. And I don't want to fall into a kind of any sort of support for a liberal pluralist theory that, you know, it just depends on the journalist or whatever. But I am arguing that in certain historical moments things can get interesting in ways that maybe weren't expected. Now, there was a big demonstration on February the 15th, 2003, actually the biggest demonstration in Britain ever, the biggest series of demonstrations in the world ever. Millions of people, 30 million people marched on the same day, 2 million in Britain. Very, very interesting. And actually, we didn't expect it at the time, but in the run-up to that demonstration and during the demonstration, we got a huge amount of media coverage. I mean, forget the ignorance, forget the BBC not reporting. The BBC had 20 camera crews down on the demo. It was almost live on BBC 24. It was live on Sky. It was almost like a royal occasion. You know, it became a kind of a British event, and the media reflected that. Now, all the main papers covered it. The Daily Telegraph, which, as you probably know, is basically a right-wing paper, ran on the Monday after the demonstration a 4-page colour supplement which was basically photo montage of the demonstrations. They had 5 interviews with participants under the headline "Why I Marched." One one interview under the headline, Why I Didn't March, which for some reason was actually Germaine Greer saying that she was very sorry that she wasn't there, but she'd been busy on the day, which was bizarre. But anyway, maybe they had trouble finding anyone who was going to be hostile to it. But basically, that's a kind of example of what happened, and we were quite shell-shocked by it in a good way. And this is something that I've been researching, and my research showed that 8 mainstream newspapers in Britain and the BBC, the coverage of the big demos, the 3 really big demos, showed that not only was there an enormous amount of coverage, but only, and this is fairly random, but 19%, according to my calculations, 19% of the coverage was unfavourable. The rest was either neutral, supportive, or, in the case of 7%, promotional of the demonstrations. And that was something that was even more startling. It wasn't just that we got a hearing, and it wasn't just that, these demonstrations were the main event for a week in the media. It was that serious sections of the media, actually in the days running up to the demonstrations, were running headlines saying, this is why you should go on this demonstration. The Daily Mirror, mass circulation tabloid, spent essentially 8 months working alongside us, effectively, trying to get the people out on the demo. They produced placards on the demonstration. But it wasn't just them. I mean, all the papers, with the exception, interestingly, of the Murdoch press. Murdoch managed to hold the line, actually. 171 titles around the world, only 1 was against the war. But the Murdoch papers didn't do this. But all the other papers carried maps in the days before the demonstrations of how do you get to the demonstration, this is where the transport is. The BBC weatherman, I remember thinking had I been taking drugs or something? The night before the demo, I was watching the BBC News. The weatherman said, if you're going on the demonstration tomorrow, wrap up warm, it's going to be cold. And so, I mean, looking back on that, that is really quite an incredible thing. So, this is one example, I think quite an important example of how, the paradigm can break down, and how, in a sense, for all the value of their insights, the Chomskyite view of the propaganda model and the Foucauldian view of power being so deeply inserted into everyday society that we can't even notice it, let alone challenge it, I think have got serious limitations. And I just want to end by just sort of suggesting, I suppose from my research and thinking about it, and interviews and so forth, some of the reasons why this might have been in this case, and maybe others as well. The first thing is clearly the size of the demonstrations, completely unprecedented. In that basic raw kind of news sense, it was much more difficult to ignore a demonstration of 2 million than it is to ignore a demonstration of 2,000. That's an argument, by the way, for the importance of big mobilisations for the movement. Secondly, the movement coincided with a quite serious crisis within the establishment over the question of the war, which I actually think has been downplayed in the history. I've been looking at some of the insider accounts of what happened in Downing Street and Whitehall and other places in the establishment during the war. And there's absolutely no question about it, but that the political elites were terrified of the movement, they were terrified of anti-war opinion, and that actually Jack Straw, for what it's worth, and Hoon and other senior government figures were begging Tony Blair to pull out right up until the last minute, and it was a close-run thing. George Bush actually had a conversation with Tony Blair 8 days before the war started, saying, look, I know you've got big problems. If you want to back off and not come with us, we'll go it alone, don't worry. And so I think there's an underestimation, actually, in the collective memory about, and we didn't realise it at the time, the extent to which there was real chaos behind the closed doors of Whitehall and to some extent Washington. But I think this had an effect on the media. Inevitably, this has an effect on the media, I think. That kind of division and uncertainty inside the corridors of power. The third thing is, flowing from points 1 and 2, is that the people who work in the media are not kind of totally insulated from the rest of society. And when you've got a crisis, and when you've got a mass movement of that scale, and when you've got kind of ideological ferment going on, journalists, they may be well paid, and a lot of them live in the leafier parts of town, but they're not immune from questioning what's going on. And I mean, there's no question but that many journalists came on the demonstrations, and we know this because the BBC again issued an edict to its senior representatives, its senior journalists in the days before February the 15th, saying thou shalt not go on the demonstration except to record it and report it. Incredible that that's true. So clearly they were worried about the fact that there was a kind of infection going on. You know, the kind of attempt to immunise the media from the rest of society was breaking down. And you've got this extraordinary situation where, again, looking back on it, it seems even weirder than it did at the time. But journalists, so very mainstream liberal journalists like Jonathan Freedland and Madeline Bunting and Paul Routledge, you know, all broadly on the left, but nevertheless very, very moderate in general terms, wrote sort of paeans to demonstrations and protest and wax lyrical about people power in the columns of the national press. I'll just give you a quote from Jonathan Freedland. I don't know how many of you know. Do you know who he is? Have you followed his work at all? But anyway, you might be surprised. Demonstrations have tremendous power. The emotional experience of standing together in a shared cause serves as a political glue, and it reveals the state of public opinion more dramatically than any opinion poll ever could. This is, you know, a mainstream comment piece by a journalist who's, you know, by no means associated with the movement at all. But this is the impact that changes in the real world can have. And I think one of the fourth point I want to make just about the causation, you know, according to my kind of analysis of it, is that I think the background to this is a sense which exists in the media and elsewhere of a terrible democratic deficit and a kind of breakdown of the relations between the political elite and the rest of society, which, you know, I mean, has to be, anyone who's looking at the way the world is today has to be brought into account. I think this is also one of the reasons why this has happened. So just to conclude on my thoughts and sort of, you know, what the conclusions might be. I mean, I think it's very, very important when in academia or in the media or anywhere, or in the movement or anywhere else, we look at the way the media works. We can't examine it in isolation. We have to see that the media is part of a wider society. It's not immune from the contradictions that exist in the wider society and the ideological churn that exists in the wider society. And actually, notions of free speech and balance, which, you know, arguably are very often used to kind of limit and to create sort of parameters around what is acceptable discourse in society. And I think they serve that process very well. I mean, basically, most of the time, you're only allowed to discuss the ideas that run from the spectrum of, you know, UKIP to Ed Miliband, which is, you know, intellectually challenging, really. But, you know, those ideas of balance can serve a different purpose when you have millions of people taking to the streets. Because suddenly, you know, the idea of ordinary people mobilising and doing things themselves can become a player that is hard to ignore in the general social debate. And in those circumstances, the liberal view that, you know, we've got to interrogate what all sorts of different people think can actually become something the movement has to use and can use. And just to prove the point, I mean, one of the things about the end of this story, really, or at least for the time being, perhaps, maybe not, but an event that took place sort of in the year or so after the demonstrations, the big demonstrations, was there was a real attempt to close down the debate that had happened, the ferment that happened in the media. There was which is how I interpret the whole Hutt and Andrew Gilligan incident, where there was a straight case of intimidating the BBC and intimidating the journalists in the BBC by making a scapegoat out of a journalist who essentially had told truth unto power. And something similar happened at the Daily Mirror, actually, where the editor, Piers Morgan, was basically dragged out of the building in 2004 for various reasons, against the protests of the vast majority of journalists. So there was a kind of restabilisation process that took place, which in a way underlines the fact that even the elites had realised that something had gone wrong from their point of view. So, I mean, really, I suppose I'm urging a kind of complex and sort of total understanding of the way the media works, that it's not immune from wider stresses and strains within society, and that we have to modify the kind of blanket pessimism which says that you can't make a difference to what happens, the messages that come out of the media. And I think this is very important as we face a situation where, as I say, there is at the same time the emergence of really big movements, really important movements, popular movements, at the same time as in many places serious crisis in society. And the outcome has been, I think, in terms of the wars, that although they managed to shut down the debate to a large extent in the media, we live in a world now, in Britain at least, where the overwhelming majority of people, despite the reinforced propaganda about the wars and the attempt to sell them again, the overwhelming majority of people in Britain are against the wars, think these wars were wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that further wars in Syria, Libya and elsewhere are completely wrong. Actually, the opinion polls now are much more against war than they were even back in 2003. So in a certain sense, as long as it's taken in the right way and as a kind of a reasonably nuanced argument, I think this is a reason for optimism that mass movements can have and ultimately must have an influence on the way ideas are generated in society.
Thank you very much. So we finish here on a note of optimism. Okay, so before I open the floor to questions, I was wondering if you had any comments, any responses to each other's individual members of the panel, if you had any questions to each other. Otherwise, I'll open the floor to questions. No? You're fine? No? Okay, so questions. Yes.
I have a question to Chris, but can be extended to all of you, of course. I agree with you that we should overcome certain Chomsky and Foucaultian accounts for what concern the relationship between the press and, I wouldn't call them protesters, but involved citizens. Don't you think that this change in the press after 2002, you said, if I'm not wrong, comes also from the fact that these people are being considered as markets now as well, as possible readership, since we're talking about very opinionated readers. So I'm reading this, I disagree with this, I will never buy this newspaper anymore. Of course, I'm reducing the issue here. When I did my field research about Italy, I found out that there was a newspaper that endorsed the instances of a social movement in order to create a new readership. And in only a few months, it reached 200,000 copies sold. That, considering the very narrow readership in Italy, is an extraordinary result. So I just wonder if you think that this could be an issue that should be taken into account. Thanks.
And I will also ask you to identify yourselves before you. That's Lorenzo Coretti from the University of Westminster. Chris, would you like to respond?
Do you want me to respond?
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that's very important that, you know, the media is competitive, it's driven by competition, and one of the things they're concerned about is markets. And I've no doubt that one of the concerns of Piers Morgan, who was the editor of the Daily Mirror back in 2002 when they swung into a position of being against the war, one of the considerations was there was a niche market there. I think there's very little doubt about that. Although I don't actually think in his case it was maybe the main thing. I think genuinely he reflected a section of the establishment that thought that Iraq was a mistake. So I think the two things came together. But I mean, this is true. This is exactly the point, that there are these contradictions in the way that the media, the mass media operates, that are kind of excluded from some of the accounts, and need to be factored back in order for us to get a kind of overview, a real understanding of how the media work. And obviously, market competition is one of the main ones.
Well, just to add one thing to that, I mean, I've written that I think what happened to the Chomsky and Herman model is, if it was mainly true in a sort of hierarchical late 20th century capitalism, then it fell apart once the internet. If you look at the latest issue, the later editions where they're trying to deal with the internet, the assumption is this will be dominated by big companies. Look, AOL Time Warner's trying to make this walled garden where you have to get everything through AOL. The assumption was that corporate control of the internet meant it would just become a one-way tool for ideology like the MSM is. But in fact, it's been the other way around. I've observed it slightly blowing up the MSM. But let me add what I think is why. It's true that the main way that the British mainstream media, the main reason it reflects a sort of ideology of the elite, which is happier with the world as it is not just that they all live in big mansions in the Oxfordshire countryside or whatever, because they don't all, but first of all, it's very difficult for a working class person to get into the media. So you can't, you might be studying here, whatever, but when it comes to the filters that get you in, the work experience, the courses that cost 12 grand a term, which have the placements, all that, then it's more. Then when you get to the interview, do you speak the language of the other elite? I speak as a non-elite person who works there, and it's not a secret to my bosses. Mark Thompson, et al., Entwistle, all know, because I've emailed them on numerous occasions, that your psychometric tests, your Oxbridge bias, is what your main reinforcer is. It's not that they sit there every morning going, right, how can we reinforce that? It is that they live the life. However, what you described, Chris, the great panoply of opinion from Farage to Miliband, I joke, it is because that's what you learn at the elite universities, that is opinion. Now, I would give credit to a lot of people in the media for at least understanding that viewpoint collided with the masses, with reality over two events. One is the Iraq War, where it doesn't matter to them whether it was just or unjust, or they liked it or didn't, or you got 1 million people or what. The fact is they never found the WMDs. And I know people who were dispatched to find those WMDs, and they didn't have as much luck as the Daily Telegraph guy did with finding George Galloway's document. We've often wondered why that was. So nobody found any WMDs. And these are people who've been briefed by, their security sources. There are WMDs, definitely. That's why we're going to war. So their mindset fell apart there. And then, we used to sit in Newsnight, sit around in the mid-2000s going, look, housing market's going to crash. There's something wrong in the system that doesn't look right. And we can't work out what it is. Why is it the housing market is exponentially growing and it never crashes? And we'd sit around, and I remember once one of my bosses just simply said to me, maybe you're wrong, Paul, maybe it will go on rising forever. And maybe we just have to stop reporting that it's going to crash one day and actually accept it will just rise forever. Okay, but imagine, that was a perfectly rational empiricist, this guy is not being, arch here, he's being empiricist. Empirically, it just keeps going like this. Now, imagine the shock to that person and people like them when Lehman Brothers goes. How could they imagine a bank going? So they have a war fought on a pretense that turned out not to be right. There's a technical term for that. And then a financial system that collapses. And I think that's why it's in turmoil.
Thank you. Yes.
This is a question for Paul Mason. You've got the wrong title and job, haven't you? Shouldn't you be called fireman protest correspondent?
I could do.
You should be sitting in a warm TV studio talking trade figures to Paxo, instead of which you're like a moth, you're attracted to protest.
I am.
Why?
Well, I'm not just attracted to protest. If I thought, you look at the scoop that Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian just got, okay? My experience about how to get scoops like that, looking at the people who do them, like, for example, Seymour Hersh, probably the greatest living journalist, I think, is by being on the inside. That's how you get, and the way you do that is you're on the inside with people. This indeed is how, if indeed, I think we all accept it was the case, that what's the name of the guy who got the WND story, Andrew Gilligan. That's how Gilligan got his story, his massive scoop. I think that's the biggest scoop in recent history. Or you pretend to be somebody. We have rules that don't allow you to pretend to be a sheikh and get Sven Göran Eriksson to offer you money. Okay, I think in the subject that I cover, I've often asked myself, how could I have found out that Lehman Brothers was misaccounting before, and that it was going to go bust before it did? Okay, two days before RBS went bust, somebody phoned me up and said, I think RBS is struggling to fund itself overnight. I can't rush to the air and say, RBS is going bust, everybody, on the basis of one source. And of course, you ring them up and they say nonsense, okay? The only way one could have got it is to either do a Mazar Mahmood and pretend and get a job and pretend to be a Lehman Brothers executive, or to hack their server. And I think that seriously, that neither of those things I think is particularly ethical. It doesn't lead you to you don't want to be doing that normally to people, pretending you're not who you are or hacking people. And therefore, the world of financial journalism, which is an economic journalism, to me, is a very unproductive world on scoops, whereas one only has to get on a plane, get off the plane, drag one's roller case through the middle of the riot, dump it in the reception, get one's camera out, go, and you've got a story that nobody else has got. The reason nobody else has got it is because, as we've been through, very few people are interested in it. And yet, to me, it is as interesting as, you know, if I've lived through the French Revolution, I'd have probably been interested in two things. One, the Napoleonic Wars. Three things. Two, the actual revolution. Three, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, Dennis Diderot, and the rest. The ideas, the revolts, and the wars. That's I don't understand people who are not interested in those things.
Thank you. We have a question there.
Yes, I just had one thought I wanted to share. I mean, I'm totally agree with all this criticism that mass media tend to have a biased media coverage of protests, and it's all very well known. But let's assume we would live in a world where they would cover all the protests correctly and would 100% just mediate the message. Wouldn't that be a little bit awkward? I mean, I remember there is a left newspaper who once wrote a little bit ironically, yeah, now also the right-wing newspapers agree with us. What have we done wrong? So the point is that maybe it's not only about truth. It's not only about in journalism. It's about the value of covering things objectively and impartially. But maybe in politics, it's also about taking side and the drama of conflict. And maybe in this drama, newspapers also play a political role. I mean, this leads me also to the question, who of the reader really believes what in tabloids or in some mass media is portrayed about protests? I mean, maybe I'm not a general type of reader, but I'm quite, for me it's quite normal to read in the conservative newspapers something very bad about left protests. If it would be different, I would be a little bit suspicious about this protest.
Would you like to respond to that?
I'm not sure if I got the question, to be honest with you.
I guess the main question is like, would you like right-wing, maybe very hateful media to be supporting you? Wouldn't that be a problem?
That was the challenge. Like someone being involved in the press team of Occupy. Ideally, I would be more interested to see a positive story in the Sun than in the Guardian, because in the Guardian we knew that we got the good story anyway in there.
Yeah.
But getting a good story in the Sun, which obviously has bigger readership as well, and it gives you the opportunity to reach a different audience. That's a challenge, and we did have a couple of those stories. For example, like the Daily Mail. I remember once they called and they pretended that they were calling from a local paper. They didn't say they were from the Daily Mail, but we had a chat. At first, they started asking about the small businesses that are affected by the camp at St. Paul's Cathedral, and how about that butcher that is now is not making any money. And I was like, okay, well, it's kind of talk to them in the same language, using like examples of like, how about all the small businesses that went bust because of the financial crisis. So that basically resulted the day after. It was pretty good story in the Daily Mail. Again, focusing, of course, on the the messaging again was about small businesses and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't about austerity and cuts, but still it was it wasn't a bad story. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and it's ideally that's what you want to see if you want to build a mainstream movement. You want to see different media outlets at least agreeing with parts of your message, if not everything.
Chris, do you have a response to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance to be struck in two senses here. One is that, the kind of the we have to sort of take on board the cynicism that that people have who've protested over the years about the way the media responds, and we have to understand in the way that Paul, I think, does, is that to an extent that is structured into the situation. On the other hand, we have to aspire, anyone who's serious about democracy, who's serious about believing that there are fundamental problems with the way things are at the moment, has to aspire to winning intellectual arguments. And I think it's very important that we don't sort of in advance just rule out the possibility that we can get support in unexpected quarters. I mean, Peter Oborne is a Daily Mail journalist. He's a high Tory, and on a lot of social questions, I'd be a million miles from him. Peter Oborne, a very, very senior figure, out of the blue, suddenly turned around in 2003 and said, "Look, I supported the war 6 months ago. I now realise it's completely wrong." And because the media has a sort of relative autonomy, and I think that's important. The other aspect of the balance, I think, is on the one hand, having a relatively open view about the way the media, about how you can interact with the media. On the other hand, I think it's very important, and the movement doesn't kind of tailor its messages too much, and kind of make too many compromises to a kind of sensationalist agenda or to, some of the agendas that the media does pursue, because then you can get into difficulties. Then if you start to narrow it down, which I think a lot of the NGOs do, they're sort of so worried about appealing to the media. It's a bit like the obsession with Murdoch, the Labour Party's obsession with Murdoch. Murdoch's all powerful, therefore we have to be like him. I think that's been a big problem, actually, on the left in this country for decades now. So I think there's an openness, and I think we have to go into this without preconceptions, too many preconceptions. At the same time, it's important not to kind of bow down to their agendas.
Can I just add a couple of other points? Just addressing both that and the previous thing. What it seems to me that who sets the media agenda on responding to these big protests? So you're saying suppose it was reported adequately. There's an interesting difference between the way giant media stroke content organizations relate to this and newspapers and TV programs. And what do I mean by that? Google, Facebook, Yahoo to an extent, certainly Twitter, do not wake up every morning and think, right, who are these protests? Who are these protesters? You're not interested. Who are these lesbians and gays? They don't think like, or who are these Muslims either? I went to Zeitgeist, Google Zeitgeist, and there was a big thing there about Islam and understanding what youthful Islamist politics is, which is often radical Islam. There was none of the prejudice you see you could go across the board from probably the Observer to the Daily Mail and see more blinkered thinking than you did at Google. So now what happens there is that is trickling down, because actually the business interests in all these places are the major organizations. So even if a TV executive from the BBC or Sky or somebody who runs a section of The Guardian gets invited to Google's offices, it's like a sort of, it's like being invited to the manor house of the medieval baron. They feel tiny. And therefore, when they hear these ideas that are far less judgmental coming down, I think that's filtered down in such a way. But the other thing I was going to say is about, it's a great thought experiment. What if it was reported right? But just imagine what would it feel like? It would be a great thing to do at this university, maybe, to take the editorial mindset and team, or, you know, and methods of some of the iconic media brands, and discuss what it would feel like for them to be reporting it right. Sometimes I think they don't get it far wrong. The interesting thing is often when the protesters have actually spoken to a general thing. Now, you could say, well, that's good. Protesters should always therefore speak to a general thing, or really hit you, like, or one of their things goes mimetic, like the woman in red in Taksim Square. She got sprayed she's gone viral. Okay, the unfairness is that mainstream politics doesn't have to do that. It doesn't have to come with a catchphrase or a viral meme or kind of an interesting story. It just gets that coverage as of right. And that is what I think is wrong currently.
Just to answer to Chris,
Yes.
very briefly, I completely agree with you. I don't think that if you want to be a movement, then you have to stick to your core values. What I was trying to express earlier, it's about the messaging and the language that you use. The values should always be the same. It's, as you said, like many NGOs are making the mistake of basically trying to appeal to an audience and just losing their values in the way. For example, let's say like an example of an environmental movement trying to appeal to people, convince them to turn off the light because they will save money, because that is the wrong value, because then when those people have the option to because they trigger the value, the wrong values of saving money and economy, as opposed to environmental values. So in that sense, yes, it's wrong. But then, in terms of messaging and language, I think it's very important to be aware who you talk to and use the language that the reader will understand. I think.
Yeah, fair enough. We have a question here.
So I guess do I just speak closer?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I have a question about media and power in these kinds of representations that you're talking about, and it turns around the question of objectivity versus subjectivity. So, for example, the alternative media people that I research with, they say that the mainstream media doesn't have the capacity to be objective anymore. It's lost that capacity, or maybe it never had it. And so they are not trying to be objective. They're intentionally and openly being subjective in their reporting. And so I think there's a way in which even if, say, the question of getting it right or accurately representing a movement is maybe in a sense, the wrong question. And what do I mean by that? So I think that there are ways in which a protest movement can be framed positively and still misconstruct the subject positions of the actors who are protesting. So not attributing, so treating them as marginalized, not treating them as being empowered subjects, that kind of thing. So my question is, can the media actually, my question is, that I think we're asking the wrong question. So that the question shouldn't necessarily be, can the media get it right? But I think, so I want to put to you, should we be instead asking a question more along the lines of, I mean, how does the media, whether it's alternative media, social media, mainstream media, construct us as subjects of democracy with agency and opportunities to shape political direction in our societies?
Thank you. Would you like to respond to that?
I want to think about that for a bit.
Yeah, same here.
Who would like to go first?
No.
No.
But just let me ask you then. What do you mean if it's not objective subjective? Just that last bit which you came to. Just repeat that for me, because I was.
The question that I think we should be, instead of saying can the media get it right or how does the media get it right, how does the media how does the media just construct us as citizens, as subjects, as people, as individuals or groups or collectivities who have or don't have power in society? And how does it tell us whether we're one of the people that has power or one of the people who doesn't have power? And also, so how are different people framed out of that? For example, the Occupy movement has largely framed by mainstream media as being an economic movement, and yet people in the Occupy movement said no. Well, like we're women, we have gender, we have racialized subjectivities, we're immigrants, we are environmentalists, we have all of these different positions, and yet it was that wasn't really framed as such in the mainstream media.
Well, I can just throw one thing back then. I don't think anymore that the media is constructing. I don't think there is a kind of ideological, whether it's an organism or a machine, that constructs the individual in the way that it did in the mid-20th century. My sort of one-liner that I always say about this is that if you give Frodo Baggins a mobile phone, the actual plot of Lord of the Rings gets very short. And in fact, the film is just condensable to about 10 minutes. He's not going to do any of that stuff. You know, Frodo, don't go that way, go this way. On a more serious note, if you could give somebody at the Nuremberg rallies a mobile phone, if you could give them the internet, you just imagine, or Stalinism, the way people's ideology was constructed from above through the hierarchical means. And then later, in the late 20th century, yes, the absolute control of states and elites over dissemination of media. I just think instead of we're now in a sort of, if that was 2 dimensions, we're now in a 3-dimensional world. The third dimension is peer-to-peer communication. Now, I think one of the interesting studies, I wish we had the ability to aggregate and data mine social media, because if we could, we probably also, in a better way than we have, we could probably watch the self-creation of ideologies through memes. I mean, because I've written that, studying, say, the Arab Spring is not simply studying that, the people demand the fall of a regime becomes a meme, or that Facebook becomes a meme, people hold it up. That is true. The really interesting thing is who's sitting in their office in Sweden watched it. Who were they? Who did they share it with? A lot of memes are jokes. That's why you can't separate them. They're to do with, there's one in Greece, I'm spinning. There's a woman who goes, there's some, I can't remember the Greek for it, but people tag the walls, I'm being tortured, I'm being tortured. And something happened, like some women who just decided that their response to it was, I'm spinning. I don't know what there's some kind of a meaning to it in Greek. Anyway, you see it all the way through, I'm spinning. And it just means I'm out of control in the middle of all this. What does that mean? The kind of Dawkins, meme study of memes is really interesting there. But I want to see how it was passed on, because I think if we could then really study it, really data mine it, we'd find the creation of a kind of alter ideology that it exists, that means and it surrounds our bosses in the media, and they know it's there. They know that everything they do can be slightly made to ridicule, or can be subverted, and that even censors can't really get around. You can't censor I'm spinning. You can paper over graffiti, but you can't tell me what it really means. It just means something big to people.
Well, just a thought. I'm actually very much in favour of the sort of defence of the concept of objectivity with all its limitations, because I think in a way, funnily enough, it's been abandoned openly by the mainstream media in favour of the notion of balance, which is something very different. And the problem with the notion of balance is, all in a way, if you want to sort of reduce the world to some sort of dualism, I can see the purpose of it, but it depends on which particular points of view you regard as being the two that are balancing each other. So it depends where you put yourself on the spectrum. For example, the debates over immigration at the moment in the mainstream media. The balance is, on the one hand, people who want to sort of stop all immigration, and the others who just want to limit it, and limit it to certain people and let skilled people in, the notion of balance is open to all sorts of random and not very useful abuse. And I think, the idea of sort of investigative journalism, the idea of trying to get to grips with the facts, trying to assess and analyse a situation, is, in the current situation at least, is something that we need to fight for and cling on to. And having said that, I also think it's very important not to... There's parts of the kind of the sort of media academic world and the liberal left, who have a very rejectionist attitude towards the mainstream at the moment. I'm thinking of the sort of media lens people who, you know, who basically think the whole thing's gone kaput and all they can do is stand on the outside and take pot shots at what's happening in the media. That seems to me wrong as well, and I think we have to kind of engage. And even when it comes to the question of balance, actually, you know, if that's the concept that they're starting with, I mean, I want to challenge it in as many ways as possible. But also, I think we have to contest for the right to having a say in the world of balance, and say, you know, is it really right that balance should end at the point where you get to Ed Miliband? And in fact, let's look at the opinion polls. You know, the majority of people on most issues in Britain are actually to the left of Ed Miliband, and therefore why should they not have some say in this balance? So I think we have to engage, you know, engage with the kind of the sort of current debates and the current practices without accepting them, but certainly not just stand on the sidelines and say the whole thing is pointless and lost, you know.
We have time. Well, we're out of time, but perhaps we can take one more question, last question, and then it's off to the wine reception. Yes, we have. Oh, we have a question already there. Yes.
I have a question to Chris. I'm hoping you could help me understand a bizarre news story, which is Nick Griffin of the BNP visited Syria 2 days ago and is tweeting from Damascus, voicing support to the president of Syria and sort of like saying that he's fighting Salafis and Britain should support him. So in like that news story and with the background of the far right in England, sort of, I don't know, I have a feeling they started to educate themselves on Islam, and like the leader of the Defense League was like distinguishing between Wahhabi Islam and mainstream Islam. So I was wondering if how would you contextualize this, and whether like there's something new happening in the way the far right is dealing and reacting to the issue of Islam, and how that relates to mainstream media coverage and social media.
Chris, would you like to?
Well, I think that opens up a whole new world of discussion, which is a very interesting one. And I think, I mean, we probably haven't got time because we've got to go and drink wine. But what I will say is that, I mean, I think you've definitely touched on a very important change in the sort of, which has been happening for the last decade or so, in terms of the relationship between what I'd describe as kind of extreme, you know, basically marginal sort of fascist voices in British society and the more mainstream right. And unfortunately, on the question of Islam, I think that this is one of the cases where the kind of balance, the accepted media spectrum is very, very narrow, and that actually there is, you know, right across the board in different ways, there is, if not a consensus, then at least a kind of converging discourse which really does marginalise the Muslim communities, which really does suggest that, you know, Islam is a very backward element in British society, to be feared, to be dealt with, that it's a problem, and that this is coming out not just of the media, but from a lot of political voices as well. And that there is that, as you say, the far right is getting wise to this, and there's a kind of, I mean, you know, I don't want to exaggerate it because I think it's just a kind of incipient thing, but I do think this is quite a dangerous development, and actually it's all connected to the war as well, clearly, and I think that, you know, one of the things that Stop the War is quite keen on, as amongst others at the moment in terms of the media, is really trying to challenge this this growing kind of demonisation and marginalisation of the Muslim communities and of Islam in general, because I think it can lead into very, very dangerous waters in British society, and it can be exploited by people with some very, very nasty agendas. And, you know, it's all, as I say, it's all tied up with the war. I mean, you know, one of the things that's really struck me recently is the way in which the media has basically almost universally, with some important exceptions, taken the line that the Woolwich, that you can't look at the Woolwich incident, the horrible, terrible attack in Woolwich, in the context of the war on terror, that you're not allowed to mention the war when it comes to discussing these things. Now, as far as I'm concerned, opposition to the war is obviously no excuse for what was a barbaric act. But nevertheless, when you have a situation where these people are actually saying, I'm doing this because of the foreign wars that Britain is involved in, if you're not even prepared to consider that as one aspect of the situation, you're making a very, very bad mistake. And I think this is, as you suggest, I think this is something that the campaigning movement needs to take up as being, given the rise of the right across Europe, as being a very, very important element of our agenda.
Okay, I think now we're entering into wine reception territory. I think we can have those discussions there. Yeah. But first of all, a round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good. I enjoyed that.
Tremendous amount of people on this campus, about 2,000, because there's something else going on as well as our conference. I need everybody to wear their badges, because if you wear the badge you were given, you'll be let into certain parts. If the badge isn't on, they might query it. So I really need everyone who is coming tomorrow to wear their badge so everyone knows you're part of the conference and you're not part of the save day. Is that okay with everyone? Wine is downstairs.
I can't come to the wine thing, so you just have to give my apologies to